How does the Old Testament God who commanded the Israelites to kill other people become a man in the person of Jesus of Nazareth and say things like, "Turn the other cheek and pray for those who persecute you"? Is this really the same God? Yes, because Scripture in both the Old and the New Testament actually describe Jesus and the Old Testament God Yahweh in very similar ways. The Old Testament God is continually depicted as slow to anger, rich in mercy and love, and deeply caring about the orphan and widow. He's also shown to be extremely patient and merciful with the rebellious nature of his people, the Israelites, whom he rescued from slavery. So this depiction of God is very much in line with what we read about with Jesus in the New Testament. But you might say, what about all those Old Testament passages where God seems to command violence? Well, this is a major biblical issue that has a lot of ancient Near Eastern nuances attached to it due to the historical and socio-cultural differences between the completely different world in the Old Testament times and the world we live in today. But let's look at what both liberal and conservative scholars say about this issue. Moderate to liberal scholars say that since Jesus did not convey or condone violence, and since Jesus is the full embodiment of this same Old Testament God, then he is the most accurate representation of God that we have. He is the ultimate criteria for evaluating Scripture, the lens through which the Hebrew Scriptures must be read. So these more liberal scholars would say the Israelites misinterpreted and distorted God's command as the Israelites merely thought they were doing what they understood and believed to be God's will at the time, much like the Christian crusade warriors back in the Middle Ages. In Hebrews 1:1-3 though, we see certain translations say we had glimpses or approximations of God in the past that was made known to us through mediators or prophets, but now we see the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. In other words, they would say, in the past, the Old Testament people had approximations of God, but now we see exactly what God looks like, right down to his very essence and being, which are interchangeable in the Greek. Essence and being mean the same thing. So they would say, Jesus' life outweighs the Old Testament depiction of God. Since God doesn't change, he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So the Old Testament God is the shadow, whereas Christ is the reality. And you understand the shadow through the lens of the reality. So we interpret the Old Testament God through the lens of Jesus. Now, conservative scholars, on the other hand, see all this very differently. They believe God had actually told the people to conquer and kill the Canaanites in the land just as it was recorded in the Bible, because they would say, ultimately sin is the destroyer, not God. And after sin entered the world, God was put in a tough situation, so to speak. So from our perspective, it seems God had to make some very tough decisions to honor the covenant he made with Abraham and his descendants, his chosen people, Israel. So there you have it. Some scholars deny the Bible accurately records God's command to the Israelite army leaders because Jesus is the embodiment of this same God, while other scholars agree with it and say it was necessary due to sin and the survival of God's people. But either way, we need to remember to look to Jesus as he is the full revelation, the full revealing of God's nature.